Okay, so I did something stupid. I recorded the podcast and forgot to turn on the capture of the PowerPoint. So I spoke for some 14 minutes and then had to re-record it. So here I am. We are now in the next section called human behavior. So in the first section we looked at the theoretical background. We defined actions, institutions, action arenas, players, and then in the second section we looked at case studies from various places and various sectors like water and harvesting the commons and so on. Now we are in human behavior. It immediately comes to figuring out how human beings behave when they are in a situation to make decisions on shared resources or the commons. The entire idea of Elinor Ostrom's work was that actually people are not always selfish in that sense, that they don't always try to maximize their own benefit even if it costs other people. So this is done in the labs just to quantify these behavioral aspects and then to see if the lab experiments correspond to reality as well. Right? So it is very important to make sure that when you're trying to sustain the goods, the commons, and there are actual resources like water, food, energy, whatever, spaces, the ocean and so on, that there is quantifiable metrics which say yes, we are sustaining them and not exploiting them unsustainably or heading towards tragedy of the commons and so on and so forth. So here the main concepts we will learn are how the laboratory experiments are performed in social sciences, see how people make decisions in controlled social dilemmas. Okay, so we are in the lab, so these are controlled social dilemmas. Explore trust, ultimatum, and dictator games. So trust game we'll look at first, and then in the second podcast we'll look at ultimatum and dictator games, where certain exchanges are involved, not always between people who know each other or people who have even seen each other or will see each other, because that's critical to see, do your decisions depend on knowing the person or seeing the person, or is it something universal in terms of human behavior about how we make decisions. Discover that experiments in jungles in the Amazon lead to different results. So this is very cute because people who do hunting, gathering and don't do don't buy things from the market think very differently about the exchanges which have you give something, you get back something, and there may be asymmetry in it, so you give more than you get back and so on. So how people decide depends a lot on how they calculate this, and weirdly enough we call it rational behavior, as we will see in a minute. So experiments in social science, then in previous chapters you have learned about the structure of action situations. In action arenas, individuals interact in action situations as we defined in the first section. Recall our examples of the chess game as an action situation that becomes an action arena when two people sit down to play. So the action situation is defined as soon as you say chess game, you know what is involved: the board, the pieces, the pawns or whatever, the players, the rules, the timing, whatever, what is at stake for the winner and so on. But when two people sit down to play, it becomes an action arena. Every chess game is played the same way. Everybody follows the same rules, i.e. the structure of the action situation does not change over time, but the outcome of every chess match is different. The decisions the players make in the action arena animate the chess action situation, but how do people make decisions in such situations? In chapter 4 we assumed that decisions were made as if people behave selfishly and rationally. This chapter will show that this is not the case in practice. People are not selfish and rational in that sense. We'll define this in a minute, but it is a good news, and this is what Elinor Ostrom discovered and designed principles for in terms of sustaining the commons, that you can have rules, monitoring, norms, punishments, etc. to sustain the commons without always creating the tragedy of the commons, triumph of the commons, as we say, right? One of the ways to study how people make decisions in action situations is through the use of experiments. There are many types of experiments, but in this chapter we focus mainly on controlled experiments in laboratory situations. Experiments are an excellent way to connect action situations with social dilemmas. when we design an experiment, we have to be explicit about the structure of the action situation. We can construct specific action situations that mimic social dilemmas that occur that people encounter in the real world. We can then systematically vary particular characteristics of the action situation to determine how changing such characteristics affects people's decisions. These are typically called sensitivity experiments, so that if you change things, how do people change their behavior, because that determines how the sustaining of the commons goes forward. Indeed, as we discuss various experiments below, you will see how changes in the action situation affect the way people make decisions. Finally, data from experiments can be compared to observations from case studies. So this is the quantification part, where you don't just do some idealized experiments in the lab that don't have any relevance to reality, any connection to reality. Okay, so let's define rational egoism, or also called rational selfishness. This is the principle that an action is rational if and only if it maximizes one's self-interest. As such, it is considered a normative form of egoism, though historically has been associated with both positive and negative forms. In its strong form, rational egoism holds that to not pursue one's own interest is unequivocally irrational. Its weaker form, however, holds that while it is rational to pursue self-interest, failing to pursue self-interest is not necessarily irrational. It's not always irrational. There are situations in which you make non-rational choices that are actually not irrational. Okay, so difference. Originally an element of nihilist philosophy in Russia, it was later popularized in English-speaking countries by Russian-American author Ayn Rand. If you don't know who it is, she was very popular at one point, maybe 70s and 80s, influenced many big thinkers and people who went on to hold responsible positions, and economists probably still debate this. Basically, in very short brief introduction, Ayn Rand proposed or argued that human beings can be perfect, and only system that works for perfect human beings is capitalism, that selfishness is not greed, that selfishness is rational. Well, there are many contradictions in the way it is said. So if everybody is perfect, then why do you need any system? Everybody does exactly what they are supposed to do, so everything will work perfectly well, and you don't need any form of government, right? So anyway, let's not go there. Okay, so the setup for an experimental laboratory typically looks like this. You can see these little desks with are shielded from the next person. So you may be sitting next to someone you may not even know and may not get to know as well. You all play on a computer, a laptop is given, and you are put in a situation where exchanges are involved and decisions are involved, where you can maximize your gain or interest, or you may be more irrational and share more than you can get away with, let's say. Okay, so we'll see what that means in a minute. So let's start with a trust game, and this is a nice figure already. This is a physical trust game. Will they catch him? So there is a guy standing here and he's falling backwards, assuming that these people will catch him, or prepare to fall if they don't catch him, because that's the trust part. So of course it matters whether these people know him and they're friends, or they're complete strangers who don't know him at all, and whether this person will trust that they will catch him may also depend on whether he knows them or not. Okay, so we begin with the so-called trust game. This two-person game was developed by Joyce Berg, John Dickhout and Kevin McCabe in 1995 to focus on the factors that affect the likelihood that an individual will take an action whose outcome may be potentially costly when that outcome depends on actions of a second individual. In simple terms, this action requires that the individual places trust in a second individual. Think about giving somebody your credit card information. Can you trust that other person will not misuse this information? The more people trust each other, the more cooperation is possible. Of course, if people easily trust each other, they are also easy victims of selfish, rational individuals who free ride on the trust of others. So we are not talking about every human being irrational in some cases in that sense, or making choices that are not definitionally rational. And this happens all the time, right? If you call the airline to book a ticket online, you are giving your credit card information, including the password and the code in the back, to a person that you don't know but is associated with the company, and you trust that the company is making sure that that information is protected and it will not be abused. Of course, credit card fraud is very common and information gets stolen and misused in many situations, but nonetheless the airlines can sell millions of tickets because they are basically earning the trust of the people by repeatedly using people in the situation to protect their information and sell them a ticket. So people begin to trust them over time. Okay, so we'll come back and look at this. Maybe I will do this in the next podcast because I'm already about 11 to 12 minutes. So let's do the details of the trust game in the next podcast. Each chapter is very small, as you already know. We'll usually 3-4 podcasts, so it's okay to keep them short, but just get a hang of what we are trying to do here. We are in the human behavior aspects of sustaining the commons, and we have to understand how humans behave in situations, action arenas where sharing and benefiting and losing are involved, and dealings are happening with people you don't know. So maybe you have some doubt about whether your good deed or your rational or let's say irrational behavior is rewarded with paying you back what you deserve, what you put into the system and what you get back. So these examples are very useful, and we will see that they do have some connections to reality. So we'll look at some data from experiments in the field to see how different people behave in terms of maximizing their self-interest. This winter the temperatures are very warm in Mumbai, high humidity is very high, pollution is very high, and I have written about it saying this is related to the Arabian Sea warming, which is related to the Middle East warming, which is related to greenhouse gases, human activities. But I went out running without worrying about the pollution, and now I got this allergy for the first time in 5 years. I used to have this in the US for pollen. Now I'm having some allergy here to probably the pollution. Hopefully it'll go away soon. Okay, see you in the next podcast.